Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 15. Before we detail what Prince Dion found when he arrived in Alexandria, since it was a great quest that lay ahead of him there, I would like to tell you of what Spartacus now saw when he began to survey his empire, and how he found this empire to be undergoing internal reforms without his oversight. These changes, sometimes called upheavals, originated in Apulon, the epicenter of the new order rumbling across the world. There had come to be two compelling factors that the Bosporan elite latched upon. First was that their many vassals were very free to act as they pleased. Almost all of the empire was in fact quasi-independent, with only a few colonies administered by the royal courts. This was displeasing and inconvenient for the state. Second was that in the Golden Age, there had been nothing that could be called a state at all, since everyone knew the natural order of things inherently. This arrangement would best be described as there being no laws, no state, only kings, and those who they had convinced to be guided by them, and since the process of selecting kings was good, this guidance never complicated people's lives or necessitated the pursuit of justice. It is hard to imagine for most people, and the Bosporan nobility was no exception to this. Yet we can all imagine something that comes close to the ideal: one law for all people, one state with no opponent for war, one king who all are guided to follow because wise men had determined that the king was good. This twisting of the Golden Age dream allowed those who would benefit from such a kind of government to champion the new path with a righteous air. These things were true of Pyrrhosides more than anyone else, although in his case he was more eager to transfer control to his bureaucracy than himself, since he was busy with other concerns. That is why he began the long process of summoning all of the hundreds of chiefs and petty kings within the empire. In small groups or individually, he had his officers treat with these rulers and integrate them into an early form of imperial structure, which then was mostly based on the form of relation between colonies and mother cities. For example, the first major development was that the Carpiani tribe was declared Bosporan in the summer of 177 prior, and thus came to hold various legal and economic obligations to the city of Apulon. In return, the removal of various barriers to merchants and the opening of salaried public offices to Carpiani nobles created opportunities that a diminishing tribe could not generate on their own. This is when the distinction between lands that were ruled by the Spartacid dynasty and those ruled by the empire in the abstract sense appeared. Similar to lands being considered the public property of a city, here what was emerging was the notion of lands being owned by the central core of humanity, that being those who had learned of Manos and all those related matters. It is said, in rhetorical contexts, that this core would grow to encompass all peoples, and hence all people would own all the world, and then, to complete Manos's vision, the concept of ownership would be turned over to the so-called natural order that will manifest when the conditions of the Golden Age are met. This, in my interpretation, is to mean that considering land to have a certain group or people who are attached to it will not be relevant, as all will connect with whatever lands the bliss of life brings them to, and similarly disconnect if that be the will of the fates or of good kings. Since there is vast debate on this, I will leave only my amateurish view of things here and concern myself with the past, not the future. The important political point is that the office of Witness of the King was created, which was to hold a mix of royal and imperial authority. It is similar to the Roman rank of governor, although in truth there are many different ranks in their system that all have this name, because they are more interested in the illusion of organization so that they might extract power from the state personally. Witnesses were more noble in their profession, and were subject to close scrutiny. There would be few people who ever attained this rank. Those who did ruled like kings in any part of the empire they chose to observe, intended to enact the will of the empire and of the Scions of Gold equally, and in turn to hear the concerns of the people and bring high authority down upon those who were blocking progress. Pyrrhosides first appointed 2 witnesses to administer his empire. One was none other than Diotrephes, who was not given any territory to administer since he was required for the army. Since the strategos was in the strange position of being legally a member of the Spartacid house, yet holding no legitimacy in that regard, this title was a new way to demonstrate his importance without the volatile politics of the royal family being invited into the discussion. More important was the second witness, who was named Cilix, and was a Bosporan of exemplary nature, in that he was not only extremely inquisitive and popular, but was from a lineage of mixed Greek and Scythian stock. He was the sort of man Parysades enjoyed to see among his staff, and that, I contend, was the primary reason Cilix was picked out for this important role. Others will note that his life had been bereft of achievements, and that during the initial days in Apulon, he was considered a ringleader of the reactionary Greek companions who wanted to do away with the lithosis. By 177 he was, at least outwardly, in line with Parysades' wishes, and hence he was sent to the Carpiani lands beyond the Sarmatian mountains to act as witness and govern here and there as he wished. To summarize his achievements, he didn't do much good or much harm, and acted more as a connected socialite who represented the good graces of the empire who sent him. People seemed to like him, but most must admit that if Parysades had serious ambitions of reform, he was the wrong man to choose. Those defending the choice will point out that the soft touch was helpful in allowing those more influenced by the science of gold to take power later, so you might call Cilix and his rule by friendship to be the warm-up to a more serious effort at achieving new things. I think this is too generous, and that the positive aspect pointed out here occurred by mistake, although we cannot rule it out being instead simply a mistake on the part of the gods. One of the first leaders of the realm to deal with witness Cilix was none other than King Spartacus, who was leading a column of officials and their guards towards the Petrodava Pass. In his retinue was the Archon of Olbia, the elected ruler of that city. Since Olbia had been a crucial part of maintaining the empire's lines of communication, Spartacus had gone in person to thank their people for their work and lenience, and had been surprised to find that in fact the people cried out for him to become their master. After large sums of money were brought from Tanais to acquire the cooperation of the nobility, the city gained various rights and boons within the empire, and that it was within the empire ceased to be doubted. Now many of the leading men of Olbia were coming with Spartacus to Apulon to see the famous collection of ancient writings bringing such clamour to the world. With witness Cilix hosting what remained of their route, the journey was comfortable and quick, although the short time Spartacus spent with Cilix left a soiled impression. We know this because the records of Apulon's courts claim that the very first thing Spartacus did after storming in without being announced was to demand someone explain how this rank of witness had come about, and why supposed commoners were placed in a role that stifled allies of the king. To Spartacus, Parysades would have been almost unrecognizable. The prince, once known for his plain, practical attire and ignoble manner, sat upon a throne decorated with leaves from all the kinds of tree found in the empire, his head bearing a golden wreath, his torso a tunic of vibrant reds once worn by Gaius Julius Caesar, on his legs long striped wraps of green and black, a getae fashion, and on his feet, of course, a sword across bare skin. The blade was a treasure of Crete, whose inlaid gemstones reflected their colours such that the prince's toes were like rainbows. Witness Diotrephes stood to his right, wearing full panoply and wielding a lance with maroon shaft and purple tassels. Gwenna Greek-speaker was among her folk in a huddle to the prince's left, paying the rest of the room no heed, and they whispered amongst themselves, all dressed in loose gowns that revealed the blues, reds and greens of their many tattoos, some with cumbersome headdresses of fur in the lithosis tradition. From this shocking stage came a simple greeting from younger brother to elder, and then Parysades stood from the throne, handed his sword to Diotrephes, and then came forward to bow to the king. All others, save Gwenna's clique, did so too, and no one dared to raise their heads before the prince, and the prince did not move until Spartacus manhandled him thus. Then a pageant of grand proportions was arranged. There were endless people who desired to meet the king they had never known, and Parysades was careful to be deferential to his brother, so that the great many people loyal to the younger would also feel ingratiated with the elder. The pair had long stories to share, and Spartacus, it seems, did not become overly angry at the political situation, since formal business in the court did not much involve him altering decisions Paereces had made, or reducing the powers Paereces had handed out to his favourites. Spartacus would not indicate as much, yet I like to believe that he was impressed that the brother he had once thought of as a wastrel had come to be something akin to a royal man, albeit one of a gaudy and unrefined character. Furthermore, the political use of the Scions of Gold, whether one believed their teachings or was cursed to miss their importance, could not be denied. There was little that tied the empire together at that time. The Romans had their iron fist and tyranny, the Seleucids had a long-established shared culture among their nobility, yet the Bosporans were simply a coalition in which one party held almost all of the military assets. The Scions of Gold offered to link each of the Bosporan peoples with common creed and purpose, and since they seemed to have good cause to make this effort, there was every hope that people would give the sages the chance they needed. Spartacus did not comment or leave much writing on his view of all this. However, we know he had the ability to put a stop to it and chose otherwise. Therefore, I think inferring his support due to at least political convenience is a reasonable course. His decrees and acts at Apulon were more involved with arranging a military force separate to the Lithosis army to guard the region, and setting to order each and everything that caught his eye, from the dirt in the back streets to the bathing habits of augurs and temple mothers. From what I have learned, he was considered something of a nuisance, but his reputation for success added weight to the long series of small tasks he gave to his people, as if there would one day be a morning when they noticed their many efforts had coalesced into once impossible achievement. If this was the case, then we should rue the stars that it was never completed. 8 months after his arrival in the city, Spartacus fell suddenly ill. He was confined to a bed, a state of affairs he sung long dirges for. Prince Paereces was not in the city, having taken his riders to patrol the frontier and quell incursions by Hermanian warbands. Hence the busy activity in the city quickly halted, and a deathly pale ran down the hillsides from the citadel to quiet all residing within the walls. It was as if the king had been struck from a state of high action and health to one of near death without any visible cause. And almost as quickly as I have written this, his life was over. There had not been a single bad omen or suspicious occurrence in the city, and everyone was shocked that they could be punished like this. The Scions of Gold declared that since Spartacus had expended all the power he had earned through his heroic life, had ruled as much as Manos judged him fit to enjoy, it was only natural that he returned to the earth so that the next king could be chosen. Anything else would cause the world to stagnate only further. Since this message was not very empathetic to the bereaved, the notion that the Scions of Gold were behind the king's death appeared all across the empire, and indeed the world after this. But in doing my duty to you to research these matters, I was not able to find anything but whispers taken as fact to fill a void of meaning. I conclude that the Scions of Gold were being honest in their statement, and the method to carry on the restoration of the world was for Spartacus to be king one day and someone else the next. Hence this occurred as surely as a tide once drawn in will soon be seen to have ebbed out. Paereces was informed of his brother's sickness and rushed back to the city to attend to him, arriving the day after Spartacus's death. As the prince rode to the citadel, he saw the townspeople burning bundles of reeds and singing old songs. While he didn't understand the words, the timbre and emotion of the chorus told him he had arrived too late, and further that the people of the city were good enough to properly mourn a ruler they had known only for a short time. Even Paereces, we should remember, hadn't known Spartacus very well, being his reflection in the mirror of the earth. Yet the time was somber, and offerings were made and ceremonies conducted in all the styles the city's people knew, which were many. Paereces led the Greek elements of these, bringing in respected Olympian officiants from Olbia and Anacopeia, along with many guests and visitors from across the entire Mediterranean. Truly, while born the prince of an ailing colony, Spartacus had risen to be among the foremost men of the world, and those who rivaled his command could be counted on one hand. That command, of course, was now to pass to his brother, and this was an ideal time for succession to work this way, since such a huge part of the empire was already in awe of Paereces after his many military feats in their localities. This transition of power occurred smoothly, and only brief mentions are made of any meaningful descent and its rapid subsidence. Following the ceremonies and administrative work to be done, which lasted until the end of summer in 176 prior, there was debate on the proper way to use Spartacus's remains. From the point of view of the lithosis and scions of gold, Spartacus should be buried without a casket in a place where people felt unhappy with their lives, and so be a permanent wellspring of good fortune for that place. You may think Paereces would agree to this. However, the royal cloak on his back was now impressing upon him the doctrine of royalty. Hence he thought that Spartacus should be entombed in a worthy mausoleum, so that his resting place would reflect the fantastic memory of his life. In this manner he was able to get his way, since the Scions of Gold were not above the king, nor were they especially wont to contradict one who was so storied and well-liked. It may have been a compromise to worldly matters that led Paereces to choose Chariskos as the site of the tomb, and not Tanais or even Chersonesus. Given how much of his life was spent in Sarai, I do wonder if the late king would have chosen this location instead. By autumn, the royal court was quick to bring all trappings of power and rule for the use of Paereces in Apulon, and it was from this point on that the original court in Tanais ceased to be used for high politics. Chariskos remained the bureaucratic centre of the Bosporan economy, but politically and legislatively the focus was on the west. The demiurgoi class were assembling at Apulon to contribute to the king's court there. Since Paereces was making no secrets of his plans to further expand the empire in the west, many warriors of all stations were drawn that way too, which mimicked the exodus of people from the First Lands at the end of the Golden Age in a way. Yet people also came to the First Lands from abroad to partake of the growing cities, and even Chersonesus was starting to be rebuilt by people arriving from the Aegean Islands. It is here, though, we must leave the theatre I have been describing for so long and consider one entirely different. For as news of Spartacus's sudden death spread around the world, it inevitably found the grand city of Alexandria on the Egyptian coast, seat of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and within, the ears of his only son, Dion. He was supposedly in the Serapeum at the time, which is a large and opulent temple that overlooks the city. When the priests there realized how dire the news was, they fled the temple in fear of Dion's reaction. That gives us some idea of the reputation the young man had already fostered among his host people, and I have found that Dion is considered an especially harsh and critical person. This must have been out of respect for his father, only the son took these measures even further, and it was said that he often brought acts of military discipline on civilians, including arranging for their execution. There were laws in the city to prevent this, but Dion was ignorant of them, and the Ptolemies were not able to intervene due to the political sensitivities involved in doing so. There, in only half a year of his role as an honoured vizier to the Ptolemaic throne, he had seen the city bow to him. And his own men and retinue were not spared from this, being subject to arbitrary and extreme lessons in good discipline, whether justice had called loudly or softly. These lessons were not ingrained. When the army learned that the king had passed, they immediately began to disobey their officers and mingle so laxly with the city folk that they were deserters in all but their drain on the city treasuries. As for Dion's reaction to the news, there is common agreement that he either did not react at all, or had any information on the topic sought out and destroyed as soon as he could. For no historian has been able to point to any detail here, despite the huge amount of records the Greeks were keeping about every measure Dion took. I dare say the young man saw it as a test from the gods, and redoubled his commitment to fulfill his duty, whatever he thought that duty might be now. The matter of insubordination among the soldiers was dealt with in a telling style. Here is what happened. The Alexandrians aided Dion in rounding up the 3 most important ringleaders of the dissenters, and recommended they be executed. Dion, to begin with, did not appear to be convinced. He asked the 3 men to show that they had worth as officers by bringing 100 hand-picked men each for a show of military finesse on the main road. This was understood to include mock battles and feats of physical fitness, and when it became known that this was taking place, people lined the streets to view the show as if it was a circus. The officers brought their selected men, ensured they were dressed in clean armor, and even took the time to arrange the formations so that the various heights and builds of the men all together produced a pleasing pattern from afar. After a short session of parading and showboating, the units stood before Dion at the steps of the city's royal museum to honor him. He laughed and said, "You are not of the time you think you are." This was the strange way in which Dion spoke, which most found unwelcome. The intent was to flavor the order given with a throw of his arm, which brought out thousands of warriors from the crowd who threw spears and shot arrows with not a moment's warning, and the chosen warriors on the promenade were massacred. So too, some say, were many witnesses who attempted to intervene in the madness. The killers were soldiers from the city garrison, who were more loyal to Dion than his own soldiers because they were sympathetic to his ruthless attitude towards troublemakers and rebels. They did not imagine that such bloodthirst could just as easily be turned upon themselves. This spectacle had been organized in tandem with the Ptolemies, whose nobles came out to declare that the overall message should be that in creating true order of the kind enjoyed in the Bosporan Empire, the city should have no mercy towards those not in line with the will of their leaders and the gods. The distinction between these two things was as a feather on the wind. It is likely that this attitude was one they had already begun to cultivate before seeking foreign aid, since it is an obvious recourse to those who do not know much about leading men, and it is not without merit either. But it was the coming of Dion that strongly emphasized this doctrine, because it was, too, the way to lead that Dion believed was best, and his advice had been purchased at such a high price that its weight was multiplied beyond the speculations of an untested foreign prince. To Dion, to attack weakness was the purpose of leading, seeing the field as one of instruction and teaching first and foremost. He had even advocated to the Ptolemies that they reconquer their troublesome lands with a sort of military demonstration along the Nile. This idea was thrown out because the Ptolemies were much better educated in these matters, and recognized that bringing out arms to people who were currently concealing their hatred for their masters would be like lighting a fire under a pot of water. In other words, the Ptolemies would be defeated quickly if they wished to bring war to their domestic enemies. However, with Dion in their hand, they sensed a trick to mend this condition. I assure you they were thinking like this because we can read all kinds of records from their archives today, which were kept very well as a matter of pride in Alexandria, along with a great deal of other fine works that I have had the pleasure of viewing more than most, yet fewer times than I would desire. I press this point because it brings out a clear interpretation of what the Ptolemies did next. They asked Dion to take his army into the field and go to war with the most violent and disruptive of their subjects. This was not because they respected his abilities and believed that being in debt to him for rescuing them was fair, but because any possible outcome of the action benefited them. If Dion enticed the rebellious people out and crushed them as effectively as he had done among his own army, then the realm would be stabilized and the Greeks could sleep soundly. If he drew battle and was defeated, it would humiliate the overly lauded Bosporans, and perhaps rid the Ptolemies of the expensive mercenary force Dion represented. Then all enmity could be pinned on said foreigners, and the Ptolemies would unite with their people against Bosporan influence. From the records I mentioned, that Dion would die and the whole affair would blow over was the most desired outcome. Dion was advised by his retinue that this was a possibility, and yet dismissed it emphatically. He was eager for battle, knowing the gravitas it offers, and so he took his army out of the city to march east towards Palestine, which is the region that joins Syria, Arabia, and Egypt at the far end of the Inner Sea. That territory had ceased paying their taxes the year prior, and many organized groups had threatened to rise up if they were challenged. After learning about the precise nature of the most powerful group, Dion realized that he would profit immensely from conquering them. Why was this? Because there in the land known as Judea, the whispers of all parties at his ears could be answered at once, be they political, military, religious, familial, and the quiet call of the earth to receive tribute in blood. We can only wonder what precisely these whispers were saying that inspired him to enact the tyranny that was now to come.